The evening started like any other Friday night at Romano's, one of those fancy restaurants downtown where the silverware probably costs more than most people's weekly groceries. James walked through the heavy glass doors with his daughter Lily, holding his hand tight. She was turning 7 today, and he'd promised her something special. He'd been saving for this dinner for 3 months. Every extra shift at the construction site, every weekend job he could pick up, it all went into a jar hidden in the back of their kitchen cabinet. Lily deserved this. She deserved to feel like a princess for one night, even if her old man couldn't afford to make it happen more often. James glanced down at his clothes and felt that familiar tug of doubt. His jeans were clean but faded, the knees worn thin from too many days on his knees laying tile. His jacket was the nicest thing he owned, a dark blue windbreaker he'd bought at a discount store 5 years ago. Next to the other customers in their pressed suits and cocktail dresses, he stuck out like a sore thumb. But Lily looked perfect. She wore her favorite yellow dress, the one with tiny flowers on it that she'd picked out herself at the thrift store. Her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, and she'd insisted on wearing her mother's old bracelet. The silver was tarnished now, but to Lily it was treasure. James's chest tightened thinking about it. His wife had been gone 2 years now, and some days it still didn't feel real. The hostess gave them a professional smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, and led them to a small table near the back. Not the worst spot, but definitely not one of the good ones by the windows. James didn't care. Lily's eyes were already huge, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the white tablecloths and the fresh roses on every table. "Daddy, it's so pretty," she whispered, like she was afraid to talk too loud in a place like this. "Not as pretty as you, kiddo," James said, and meant it. He opened the menu and tried not to wince at the prices. $30 for a pasta dish, $45 for chicken. He'd known it would be expensive, but seeing the numbers in print made his stomach flip. Across the restaurant, a group of men in expensive suits laughed loudly at something. One of them, a guy with slicked back hair and a watch that probably cost more than James's truck, was holding court. His voice carried across the dining room, full of that particular confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. "I'm telling you, the deal is as good as done," the man said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "By next quarter, we'll have bought out 3 more properties downtown. Those people don't even know what their land is worth." His companions laughed and raised their glasses. The man with the slicked hair, his name was Richard, drained his wine and immediately flagged down a waiter for another bottle. Not another glass. Another bottle. James focused on Lily, helping her sound out the words on the kids' menu. She decided on the butter noodles and chicken fingers, and he ordered the cheapest steak on the menu for himself. When the waiter left, Lily started telling him about her day at school, about the story her teacher read and the drawing she'd made in art class. That's when Richard's voice cut through the pleasant bubble they'd created. "You see that guy over there?" Richard said, not even trying to keep his voice down. "The one in the jacket that looks like it came from a dumpster?" James's shoulders tensed. He knew without looking that Richard was talking about him. Lily hadn't noticed yet, still chattering away about her friend's new puppy. "What about him?" one of Richard's friends asked. "Just wondering what he's doing in a place like this," Richard said with a snort. "Probably spent his whole paycheck to impress that kid. Hope he knows how to wash dishes because he's going to be doing a lot of them to pay his bill." The men at the table laughed. It wasn't kind laughter. It was the sort that made James's face burn and his hands curl into fists under the table. He'd heard plenty of laughs like that in his life. In school, when the other kids found out he lived in a trailer park. In the military, from officers who thought enlisted men were barely human. And now here in front of his daughter, Lily finally noticed something was wrong. "Daddy, are you okay?" James forced a smile. "I'm fine, baby girl. Just thinking about how lucky I am to have dinner with the best kid in the world." But Richard wasn't done. He stood up from his table, swaying slightly, and James realized the man was more than a little drunk. Richard walked toward them, his shoes clicking on the polished floor, and stopped right next to their table. "Evening," Richard said, looking down at them like they were something stuck to his shoe. "Couldn't help but notice you folks." "Special occasion?" James looked up at him, keeping his expression neutral. "My daughter's birthday." "How sweet," Richard said, but his tone made it sound like anything but. His eyes flicked over James's worn clothes, the faded military tattoos peeking out from under his sleeves. "Let me guess. Army, Marines?" Army, James said quietly. Medic. Of course you were, Richard said with a smirk. Well, thank you for your service and all that. He said it like he was reading from a script, like the words meant nothing. Then Richard's gaze landed on the restaurant's grand piano, sitting silent in the center of the dining room. Usually someone played it during dinner service, but tonight the pianist had called in sick. The beautiful black instrument sat there like a piece of art, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light. Tell you what, Richard announced, loud enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. I see you've got some ink there. Tough guy, right? Bet you think you're pretty special. He paused, enjoying the attention. That piano over there? I'll give you $500 cash if you can play even one decent song on it. The restaurant got quieter. People were definitely watching now. James felt Lily's hand slip into his under the table. She was confused, sensing the meanness in Richard's voice, even if she didn't fully understand what was happening. I don't think that's necessary, James said calmly. What's wrong? Can't do it? Richard pressed. It's easy money, unless you're too scared to embarrass yourself in front of all these nice people. He gestured around the restaurant with his wine glass, sloshing a bit of red onto the white tablecloth. Or maybe you just don't want your kid to see what a failure her old man really is. That last part did it. Not the insult to James himself. He'd heard worse. But talking about Lily that way, trying to humiliate him in front of his daughter on her birthday, that crossed a line. James stood up slowly. He was a big man, 6'2" and broad through the shoulders from years of physical labor. Richard took a half step back to spite himself. I'll play, James said quietly, but not for your money, and not because you think I can't. He looked down at Lily, whose eyes were starting to water. He knelt beside her chair. Remember what I always tell you about bullies, baby? That they're just scared inside? Lily whispered, that's right. And you know what else? We don't let other people's fear make us feel small. You watch Daddy, okay? And remember this. James stood and walked toward the piano, every eye in the restaurant following him. James reached the piano and stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the smooth black surface. He hadn't touched a piano in over 10 years. Not since before the military, before the deployments, before everything fell apart. His fingers felt heavy, uncertain. Behind him, Richard was already back at his table, laughing with his friends. They were making bets about how badly this was going to go. One of them said something about calling an ambulance for when the piano died of abuse. More laughter. James pulled out the bench and sat down. The leather was soft, expensive. Everything in this place was expensive, carefully chosen to remind people like him that they didn't belong. He flexed his fingers, feeling the old calluses from construction work, the newer scars from a roof job gone wrong last month. The restaurant had gone completely quiet now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped clattering dishes to watch. A few people looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere but here. Others looked curious. Some, James noticed, looked almost hungry for the entertainment, ready to watch another person's humiliation like it was a show. Lily sat at their table, her hands pressed together under her chin. She looked so small in that big chair, so worried. James caught her eye and winked. Trust me, he mouthed. Then he placed his hands on the keys. For a second, nothing happened. James closed his eyes and let himself remember. Not the war, not the hospital rooms, not the funeral. Further back, he was 16 again, in a cramped apartment with water stains on the ceiling, and his mother was lying on the couch wrapped in blankets even though it was summer. She was sick, so sick, but she was smiling at him. Play me something beautiful, baby, she'd said. Play me something that sounds like hope. James's hands began to move. The first notes rolled out across the restaurant like water, clear and pure. Not a simple melody. Not Happy Birthday or some basic tune you'd hear in a hotel lobby. This was Rachmaninoff, one of the hardest pieces ever written for piano. His fingers remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The music built slowly, each note precise and deliberate. James's hands moved faster, dancing across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so rough around the edges. His construction worker's hands, scarred and calloused, were creating something so beautiful it hurt to hear. Richard's laughter died in his throat. His wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth, frozen there as he stared. Around the restaurant, mouths fell open. An older woman near the window grabbed her husband's arm, her eyes wide. James played like he was possessed. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, tender one moment and powerful the next. His whole body moved with it, swaying slightly, completely lost in the piece. This wasn't just playing. This was pouring out everything he'd kept locked inside for years. Every loss, every sacrifice, every moment he'd had to be strong when all he wanted to do was break down. A waiter dropped a tray in the kitchen. The crash made several people jump, but James didn't even flinch. He was somewhere else entirely now. In the back of the restaurant, an old woman stood up from her table. Her name was Mrs. Romano, and she owned this place. She'd been eating in the kitchen like she did most nights, staying out of the way. But she heard the music and came out, and now she was walking slowly toward the piano with tears streaming down her face. She knew this piece. More than that, she knew this playing style. She'd been a music teacher for 40 years before opening the restaurant. She'd heard thousands of students play thousands of pieces. But this was different. This was the kind of talent you saw maybe once in a lifetime if you were lucky. James moved into the final section of the piece, the part where most pianists fell apart because it was just too technically demanding. His fingers flew across the keys so fast they blurred. The music climbed higher and higher, building to something that felt almost impossible to sustain. Lily was crying now, but not sad tears. She'd never seen her father like this. She'd known he was strong, known he was brave, known he worked hard to take care of her. But this was different. This was magic. The final chord rang out across the restaurant, hanging in the air like a question that didn't need an answer. Then silence. Complete, total silence for what felt like forever but was probably only a few seconds. Someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then the entire restaurant erupted. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, cheering like they'd just witnessed something they'd never forget. Several people were crying openly. James opened his eyes and looked down at his hands like he wasn't quite sure they belonged to him. They were shaking slightly. He stood up from the bench, feeling dizzy, feeling like he'd just run a marathon. Mrs. Romano reached him first. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she grabbed James's arm with surprising strength. "You're him," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're that James Chen, the prodigy from Brooklyn." James blinked at her in surprise. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," she said firmly. She turned to address the restaurant, her voice carrying despite her size. This man was accepted to Juilliard when he was just 16 years old. One of the youngest students they'd ever admitted. He was going to be one of the greatest pianists of his generation. The restaurant buzzed with whispers. People were pulling out their phones, already searching. James felt exposed, raw, like someone had just ripped off a bandage he'd been wearing for years. "That was a long time ago," James said quietly. "That person doesn't exist anymore." "The music says different," Mrs. Romano said. She still had tears on her cheeks. "I knew your mother, Teresa. She used to clean the offices in the building where I taught. She was so proud of you. She used to show me pictures of your performances, articles about you from the newspapers." James's throat tightened. He hadn't heard anyone say his mother's name in so long. "What happened?" Mrs. Romano asked gently. "Why did you stop?" Before James could answer, Richard appeared. His face was red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. He pulled out his wallet and started counting bills, his movements jerky and aggressive. "Fine, you can play. Here's your money," Richard said, shoving a wad of cash at James. $5,000. Consider it a donation to a struggling veteran." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, like he was the hero of this story. Like his money could erase what he'd done, what he'd said. James looked at the money, then at Richard, then at Lily, who was watching everything with those big eyes. He thought about the bills piled up at home. The leaky faucet he couldn't afford to fix. The fact that Lily's shoes were getting too small and he'd been hoping they'd last another month. Then he pushed Richard's hand away. "Keep your money," James said. "My daughter doesn't need to learn that dignity has a price tag." The restaurant burst into applause again, but Richard wasn't done. His face got even redder, and he opened his mouth to say something else. That's when Mrs. Romano stepped between them, all 5 feet of her, and looked up at Richard like he was something she'd found stuck to her shoe. "You need to leave," she said simply. "Now, and don't come back to my restaurant," Richard sputtered. "Your restaurant? I've been coming here for years. I spend thousands of dollars here. And now you'll spend them somewhere else," Mrs. Romano said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "I don't care how much money you have. I won't have you treating people like garbage under my roof." She turned back to James before Richard could respond. "You and your daughter eat free tonight, and every night from now on if you want. But more than that, I have a proposition for you." Mrs. Romano led James back to his table where Lily was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. She grabbed her father's hand the moment he sat down, squeezing it tight. "Daddy, that was amazing. I didn't know you could do that." James managed a small smile, though his hands were still shaking. "There's a lot you don't know about your old man, kiddo." Mrs. Romano pulled up a chair and sat down with them, completely ignoring the fact that she had a restaurant full of customers waiting. A younger woman who looked like she might be the manager started to approach, but Mrs. Romano waved her off. 20 years ago, Mrs. Romano began, looking directly at James. "Your mother came into my music school looking for work. She needed money for your lessons," she said. "You were this skinny little kid, maybe 6 years old, and you'd been teaching yourself to play on a broken keyboard someone had thrown out." James remembered that keyboard. Half the keys didn't work, and it had been sitting in the trash behind their apartment building. He'd dragged it up 3 flights of stairs by himself. "I gave her the cleaning job," Mrs. Romano continued, "but I also gave you free lessons. Do you remember?" "I remember," James said quietly. "You were the only teacher who didn't care that we couldn't pay." "You were the most talented student I ever had," she said, her eyes getting misty again. "When Juilliard accepted you, I cried for a week. Happy tears. I thought I'd be watching you on stages all over the world someday." The waiter brought their food, but nobody touched it. Lily watched Mrs. Romano with wide eyes, absorbing every word. "So what happened?" Mrs. Romano asked, though her voice suggested she already knew it wouldn't be a happy story. James was quiet for a long moment. He'd spent years not talking about this, not thinking about it, but something about tonight had cracked something open inside him. "Mom got sick," he said finally. "End of my first year at Juilliard, cancer, stage 4. The doctor said she had maybe 6 months if she was lucky." Mrs. Romano closed her eyes, nodding. She'd suspected something like this. "I dropped out to take care of her," James continued. "Someone had to work, had to pay for her treatments, her medications. Insurance didn't cover half of it. I got a job at a warehouse, then another one doing night shifts at a grocery store. We moved to a cheaper apartment, then an even cheaper one." Lily squeezed his hand again. She was too young to really understand, but she could hear the pain in her father's voice. She lasted 2 years, not 6 months. She was tough. James smiled slightly at the memory. Even at the end, when she could barely keep her eyes open, she'd ask me if I was still playing. I'd lie and tell her yes. I didn't have the heart to tell her I'd sold my keyboard to pay for her medicine. "Oh, James," Mrs. Romano whispered. "After she died, I had nothing. No degree, no money, debt up to my eyeballs. I was 20 years old and I felt like I was 50. So I joined the army. They paid off my debts, gave me a purpose. I became a medic." He touched the tattoo on his forearm, the one with the medical symbol intertwined with musical notes. "Did 2 tours in Afghanistan. Saw things no person should see. But I helped people. Saved some lives. Lost others?" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Met my wife over there. She was a translator. We got married. Had Lily, came back to the States thinking we'd start over. But the war followed us home. She had nightmares, panic attacks. The VA tried to help, but it wasn't enough. 3 years ago, she took her own life." The words hung in the air like lead. Lily looked down at her lap. She'd heard this story before, told in gentler ways, but it never got easier. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Romano said, and she meant it. "And you've been raising Lily on your own since then?" "Just the 2 of us," James confirmed. "I do construction work. Roofing, mostly. Some tile work, painting, whatever pays. It's not glamorous, but it keeps a roof over our heads and food on the table. Lily's happy, healthy. That's all that matters." "But you haven't played piano in all this time?" Mrs. Romano asked. "Couldn't," James said simply. "Didn't even want to. Music reminded me of everything I'd lost. My mom, my dreams, the person I used to be. It hurt too much. I figured that part of my life was just over. Until tonight," Mrs. Romano said. "Until tonight," James agreed. He looked at Lily. "Until this guy decided to try to embarrass me in front of my daughter on her birthday." "Well, he certainly picked the wrong person to mess with," Mrs. Romano said with a fierce smile. She leaned forward. "Now listen to me. I didn't just bring up your past to make you sad. I have an offer for you." James raised an eyebrow. "Play here, Friday and Saturday nights. I'll pay you $300 per night plus tips. You and Lily eat free whenever you come in. I'll work around your construction schedule." James blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing.
$600 a week for playing piano?
"You're worth 10 times that. But it's what I can afford right now," Mrs. Romano said. "My regular pianist is good, but you're extraordinary. People will come just to hear you play. I guarantee it." Before James could respond, a woman approached their table. She was one of Richard's former dinner companions, an elegant woman in her 50s wearing a pearl necklace that probably cost more than James's truck. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm. "I couldn't help but overhear. My name is Patricia Hoffman. I'm on the board of the Steinway Arts Foundation. We provide grants and support for musicians who faced hardship." She handed James a business card with gold lettering. "What you played tonight was remarkable. If you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about our career recovery program. We've helped dozens of talented musicians get back on their feet. Scholarships for lessons, connections to performance opportunities, even financial support while you rebuild." James stared at the card like it might disappear if he looked away. "I don't understand." "Why would you help me?" "Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted," Patricia said simply. "Because you deserve a second chance. And because that man you were dining with, Richard Whitmore, has spent years treating people like dirt. It's about time someone showed him that money and cruelty don't win." She glanced back at Richard's table. He was still there, looking smaller somehow while his other companions had made excuses and left. One of them was on his phone, and from the angry gestures Richard was making, it wasn't a pleasant conversation. "He's learning a valuable lesson tonight," Patricia said with satisfaction. "Actions have consequences." Mrs. Romano stood up and put her hand on James's shoulder. "You don't have to decide anything right now. But think about it. You've spent years taking care of everyone else. Your mother, your fellow soldiers, your wife, your daughter. Maybe it's time to take care of yourself too." James looked at Lily, who was watching him with those trusting eyes. "What do you think, kiddo? Should Daddy play piano again?" "Yes," Lily practically shouted, then clapped her hand over her mouth, remembering she was in a fancy restaurant. In a quieter voice, she added, "You looked really happy when you were playing. I never saw you look like that before." That hit James harder than anything else. His 7-year-old daughter had never seen him truly happy. What kind of life was that? "Okay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Okay, I'll try." Mrs. Romano beamed. Patricia smiled and promised to call him next week. And across the restaurant, other diners who'd been watching the whole scene unfold started applauding again. But in the corner, Richard sat alone at his table, his phone buzzing with angry texts and missed calls. His world was starting to unravel, one thread at a time. 3 months passed like a dream James kept waiting to wake up from. That first Friday night he played at Romano's. He was so nervous he almost called Mrs. Romano to back out. His hands were sweating, his stomach was in knots, and he kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if that night had been a fluke? What if he'd used up all his skill in that one performance? But Lily had looked at him with those big eyes and said, "You can do it, Daddy, I believe in you." So he went. The restaurant was packed. Word had spread fast about the veteran who could play like an angel, and people wanted to see for themselves. James sat down at that piano with his heart hammering in his chest, took a deep breath and played. And it was like coming home after a long, hard journey. The music poured out of him, and this time it didn't hurt. It felt like healing. By the second week, people were making reservations specifically for the nights James played. By the fourth week, Mrs. Romano had to turn people away because there wasn't enough room. Someone recorded him on their phone and posted it online, and the video went viral. Suddenly, James wasn't just playing for a restaurant full of people. He was playing for thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people who watched and shared and commented. The comments got to him sometimes. Most people were kind, saying things like, "This made me cry," or "We need more stories like this." But some people said harsh things, claimed he was faking it for attention, said his story was too convenient to be true. James tried not to read those comments, but late at night when he couldn't sleep, sometimes he'd scroll through them and feel that old familiar doubt creeping back in. Patricia from the Steinway Foundation was true to her word. She set him up with a teacher, a stern older man named Mr. Kowalski who'd once played at Carnegie Hall. The first lesson was humbling. Mr. Kowalski listened to James play for 5 minutes, then stopped him. "You have raw talent," he said bluntly. "But 10 years away from the piano has made you sloppy. Your technique is a mess. We have a lot of work to do." James had expected praise, maybe some encouragement. Instead, he got the truth, and somehow that felt better. He worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. Between construction jobs during the day, practice sessions in the afternoon, and performances on weekends, he barely slept. But he didn't complain. This felt like a gift, and he wasn't going to waste it. Lily started taking piano lessons too. Not with Mr. Kowalski, who was too intense for a 7-year-old, but with a patient young teacher named Miss Chen who taught at the community center. James would sit in the back of the room during her lessons, watching his daughter's small fingers stumble over the keys, and feel his heart swell with pride. She wasn't a natural like he'd been, but she tried so hard, practicing every night at the old upright piano that a supporter had donated to them. Their apartment had changed. It wasn't fancy, still the same small 2-bedroom in a building that needed repairs, but now there was music in it. Real music, not just the TV or the sound of traffic outside. James would practice, Lily would practice, and sometimes they'd play simple duets together that made them both laugh when one of them messed up. The money helped too. Between the restaurant gigs and the grant from the Steinway Foundation, James was able to cut back on construction work. He could actually have dinner with Lily most nights instead of coming home after she was already asleep. He fixed the leaky faucet, bought her new shoes, even saved a little bit for the first time in years. But the best part wasn't the money or the attention. It was the way Lily looked at him now. She'd always loved him, he knew that. But now there was something else in her eyes, something like pride. She told her friends at school that her daddy was a famous piano player. And even though he wasn't really famous, not in any real sense, her believing it made him want to become the man she thought he was. Then Patricia called with bigger news. The foundation was organizing a charity concert to raise money for veteran families, and they wanted James to be the featured performer. Not just playing in a restaurant, but on a real stage, in a real concert hall with a real audience who'd paid money specifically to hear him play. "I can't do that," James said immediately. "That's too much. I'm not ready." "You're more ready than you think," Patricia said calmly. "And this isn't just about you. This is about every veteran who's struggled. Every family that's been through what yours has been through. Your story gives people hope." James wanted to argue, but he thought about what Lily had said that night at the restaurant. He'd looked happy. Maybe other people needed to see that kind of happiness, needed to know that broken things could be put back together, even if the cracks still showed. He said yes. The news about the concert spread fast. The local paper did a story on him with the headline, "From Combat Medic to Concert Pianist, One Veteran's Journey." A TV station wanted to interview him, but James said no to that. He didn't want to be famous. He just wanted to play. Meanwhile, Richard's life was going in the opposite direction. James heard about it through Mrs. Romano, who heard about it from Patricia, who moved in the same social circles as Richard. Apparently, the video of Richard mocking James had made its way to some important people. Business partners who didn't appreciate being associated with someone who'd been filmed treating a veteran like trash. Charity boards who quietly asked him to step down. Country club memberships that suddenly weren't renewed. Richard tried to fix it. He made a public apology on social media, donated money to veteran causes, did interviews where he talked about learning and growing. But the internet doesn't forget, and neither do people. Every apology just brought more attention to what he'd done. His company's stock dropped. Clients left. His friends got quieter. One evening, about a week before the concert, James was at the restaurant early, practicing before the dinner crowd arrived when someone walked in. He looked up and was surprised to see Richard standing there, looking smaller and older than he had 3 months ago. Mrs. Romano moved to intercept him, but James held up a hand. "It's okay," he said. Richard approached slowly, like he was walking into enemy territory. He stopped a few feet from the piano, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. "I know you probably don't want to see me," Richard started. His voice was different now, quieter, missing that aggressive confidence. "And I'm not here to make excuses or ask for forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not because it cost me business or friends or whatever. I'm sorry because what I did was cruel and you didn't deserve it. Your daughter didn't deserve it." James studied him for a long moment. The old James, the one from 3 months ago, would have told him to leave. would have held on to the anger because anger felt safer than forgiveness. But the new James, or maybe the real James who'd been buried under years of grief and survival, felt something different. "You were drunk," James said finally, "and you were showing off for your friends." "I get it. That's not an excuse," Richard said quickly. "No, it's not," James agreed. "But I've done things I'm not proud of too. We all have. The question is what you do after." Richard nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is a check for the veteran charity concert you're doing. It's not to make myself feel better or to buy forgiveness. It's just because it's the right thing to do." He set the envelope on the piano and turned to leave. Then he stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth, watching you play that night changed something in me. Made me realize I'd become someone I didn't recognize anymore. So thank you for that." Then he was gone. James opened the envelope. The check was for $50,000. The night of the concert, James stood backstage at the Riverside Theater and tried to remember how to breathe. The theater held 800 people, and according to Patricia, every single seat was sold out. 800 people who'd paid money to hear him play. 800 people who'd be watching if he messed up. His hands were shaking again, just like they had that first night at Romano's. But this was different. This wasn't about proving something to a bully or defending his dignity. This was about all those families out there who'd lost someone, who were struggling, who needed to believe that life could get better. That was a lot heavier than playing Rachmaninoff. "Daddy, you're doing the thing with your hands," Lily said from beside him. She was wearing a new dress for the occasion, dark blue with little silver stars on it. Her hair was pulled back and she wore a small treble clef necklace that James had given her the week before. "What thing?" James asked, even though he knew exactly what she meant. "The shaky thing. Like when you're nervous." She took his hand in both of hers. "You don't have to be nervous. You're really good." James smiled down at her. "When did you get so smart?" "I was always smart," she said matter-of-factly. "You just didn't notice because you were always working." That stung a little, mostly because it was true. How many moments had he missed because he was too tired or too worried about paying bills? How many times had Lily needed him, and he'd been too buried in his own grief to see it? "You're right," he said, kneeling down to her level. "But I'm noticing now, and I'm going to keep noticing from now on, okay?" She threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, kiddo. More than anything." Patricia appeared, looking elegant in a black evening gown. "5 minutes, James, the house is full. There are even people standing in the back because they didn't want to miss it." She paused, studying his face. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," James admitted. "Good," Patricia said with a smile. "That means you care. The day you stop being nervous is the day you should worry." Mrs. Romano was there too, along with Mr. Kowalski, who'd come to watch his student perform. Even some of the regulars from the restaurant had bought tickets. James could hear the murmur of the crowd through the curtain, the sound of hundreds of conversations blending together. "You know what the best part of tonight is?" Mrs. Romano said, taking James's other hand. "Your mother would be so proud. Wherever she is, she's smiling right now." James felt his throat tighten. He'd been trying not to think about his mom all day because he knew he'd start crying if he did. But Mrs. Romano was right. His mom had sacrificed everything so he could have a chance at this life, and he'd almost thrown it all away. Almost let the pain win. Almost convinced himself he didn't deserve a second chance. The stage manager gave him a signal. It was time. James walked onto the stage and the applause hit him like a wave. The lights were bright, making it hard to see individual faces, but he could feel the energy of all those people. The piano sat in the center of the stage, spotlit, waiting. It was a beautiful instrument. A full concert grand that probably cost more than James had made in his entire life. He walked to the microphone first. He hadn't planned to say anything. Patricia told him he could just play if he wanted to, but standing there looking out at all the O's people, he felt like he needed to explain, needed them to understand. "I'm not good at speeches," he started, his voice echoing through the theater. A few people laughed, warm and encouraging. 3 months ago, I was just a guy trying to get through each day. I worked construction, raised my daughter, and tried not to think too much about the past because it hurt too much. The theater was completely quiet now. Everyone listening. Then someone tried to humiliate me, tried to make me feel small in front of my kid. And instead of making me smaller, it reminded me of who I used to be, who I could still be. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I joined the army because I needed purpose after I lost my mom. I became a medic because I wanted to save lives. And I did save some. But I lost some too. Lost my wife to demons neither of us knew how to fight. He glanced toward the side of the stage where Lily stood watching, Mrs. Romano's hand on her shoulder. For a long time, I thought my story was about loss, about all the things that got taken away, my dreams, my career, the people I loved. But standing here tonight, I realize my story is about something else. It's about getting back up. It's about second chances. It's about a 7-year-old girl who believed in her dad even when he didn't believe in himself. The applause started again, but James held up a hand. This concert is for veteran families, for people who've sacrificed and struggled and kept going even when it felt impossible. I know what that's like. I lived it. I'm still living it. But I also know something else now. I know that broken things can be beautiful, that scars tell stories worth hearing, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. He walked to the piano and sat down. His hands found the keys and suddenly the shaking stopped. This was where he belonged. This had always been where he belonged. He played for 90 minutes straight, barely pausing between pieces. He played the Rachmaninoff that had started everything. He played Chopin that made people cry. He played Beethoven that made them feel hope. He played arrangements of old folk songs that veterans in the audience recognized, songs that reminded them of home. And he played one piece he'd written himself, a simple melody he'd composed late one night thinking about his mom, his wife, all the people who'd loved him and left him. He called it Things We Carry, and it started sad but ended hopeful like life itself. When the final note faded away, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the entire theater erupted. People were on their feet, clapping and cheering and wiping tears from their faces. James stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. Lily ran onto the stage, not caring about protocol or stage rules, and threw herself into his arms. The audience loved it, clapping even harder. Mrs. Romano and Patricia joined them, and soon there was a crowd on stage, all celebrating this moment that felt bigger than just one concert. Later, after the crowds had gone and the theater was quiet, James sat at the piano one more time with Lily beside him on the bench. She put her small hands on the keys next to his larger ones. "Can you teach me that song you wrote?" she asked. "The one about carrying things?" "Sure, kiddo. But it's kind of sad." "That's okay," Lily said. "Miss Chen says the saddest songs are sometimes the most beautiful ones, because they help people feel less alone." James looked at his daughter and realized she was wiser than he'd ever given her credit for. "When did you get so smart?" he asked again. "I told you I was always smart," she said, grinning. Then she added, "But maybe I get it from you." They played together, his hands guiding hers, teaching her the melody he'd created from pain and turned into something beautiful. Outside, snow was starting to fall, the first snow of the season. Through the theater windows, James could see it coming down in soft white flakes, covering everything, making the world look clean and new. Richard's check had helped raise over $200,000 for veteran families. The concert had been featured in newspapers and online. People were talking about doing another one next year, maybe making it an annual thing. But none of that mattered as much as this moment, sitting at a piano with his daughter, teaching her that broken things could make music too, that endings could become beginnings, that the person you used to be and the person you'd become could somehow be the same person, just older, scarred, but still capable of creating something beautiful. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," Lily said softly. James kissed the top of her head. "I'm proud of us," and he was. Proud of surviving. Proud of trying again. Proud of letting people see his scars and his talent and his truth. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He'd still have hard days, still struggle with memories, still miss the people he'd lost. But he wouldn't walk that road alone anymore. And he wouldn't walk it in silence. He'd walk it with music, with hope, and with a 7-year-old girl who believed her daddy could do anything.